Hello and good morning, everyone. Welcome to the inauguration of Dr. Kevin C. Weinman as the president of Marist College. So my name is Dr. Juris Pupčenoks. I'm an associate professor of political science. And here in about less than 30 seconds, you'll hear 7 TED-style talks by Marist faculty from 6 schools here. Each of these talks will last only about 5 minutes. As a whole, they will illustrate the breadth of research and teaching, as well as the vibrant academic community that we have here at Marist College. This first speaker is Dr. Emma Fredrick, an assistant professor of psychology. Dr. Fredrick uses they, them, their pronouns.
Thank you. As Juris said, I'm Dr. Emma Fredrick. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm an assistant professor of psychology. This is my 4th year now at Marist, so I'm a senior. And in case you couldn't tell from my skirt, I'm going to be talking about the gay stuff. So I want to tell you about some research that I've done with a student of mine, Kayla McGuire, who actually started working with me in her sophomore year and now is in a Master's of Social Work program. So we are both really interested in LGBTQ experiences and trying to find ways to make life better. And so one of the things that we were interested in was what are students' experiences in the classrooms here at Marist. So we asked students about both positive and negative things that happen to them in the classroom, and we wanted to see how that relates to their perceptions of campus climate and what impact this has on their mental health. So what we found was that when we asked students, how would you rate the climate for different groups on a scale of 0, super cold, freezing, to 100, really warm and welcoming, for LGB students, not straight students, the average rating was about 69. For trans students, it was about 55, and for non-binary students was about 57. So for the not straight students, not too cold, you might want a light jacket, definitely gonna need a jacket as a queer or as a trans or non-binary student. And I also do wanna highlight that that is the overall response. So we had both cisgender straight participants and LGBTQ participants. If we look at those separately, the LGBTQ students' average rating was about 10 points lower, and the cis straight participants were about 10 points higher. So there's actually a big disparity in how LGBTQ students perceive their experiences versus how people outside of that community perceive their experiences. And how this relates to health is that what we found was that the perception of campus climate predicted psychological distress, such that students who rated campus climate more negatively, more cold, reported higher levels of psychological distress, which includes symptoms of anxiety and depression. So we know those are the 2 most common mental health issues that students are dealing with. We don't want to exacerbate that anyway. We also found that it was predictive of sense of belonging. Students who said that campus was warm were more likely to report a sense of belonging on campus. And sense of belonging is important in and of itself, but it's also important for a number of things that we as people interested in Marist should be interested in. So sense of belonging is a key predictor of retention, and it's also a key predictor of motivation and enjoyment of academics. So if we want students to, not just stay at Marist, but be excited to stay at Marist, be excited to go to classes, we want them to feel like they belong. So what was happening in the classroom that impacted these experiences that students were talking about? The most predictive factor in terms of negative responses, it's cold here, was actually student comments, hearing derogatory comments from their peers. So if you're a faculty person, you might be wondering, okay, that sucks, but what should I do about it? One of the biggest predictors of a positive score was faculty members saying something about derogatory comments when they happened. So if you hear a derogatory comment, saying something in the moment to kind of challenge whatever was said, let the student know who may have been impacted that they do belong, you're looking out for them, is really, really important. The other things that we saw that were related to positive ratings were inclusion in the classroom, whether this was through reading material, discussions in class, talking about people who had these identities. All of those were related to warmer feelings of campus climate. And the last thing that we found in this particular study that was related was faculty members asking students their names and pronouns. So giving students the opportunity to tell you who they are instead of making assumptions. And this is something that is really easy to implement. The way that I do this is I just send out a survey before the semester starts. And I ask them a bunch of stuff that's useful as a faculty member, but name and pronouns is one of them. Kayla then went on to do some research looking at gender-inclusive housing. So she actually did a project the semester before we implemented gender-inclusive housing, finding that LGBTQ students in general had some issues with housing, and that a significant number moved off campus because of these issues. She then followed up the next semester once we implemented gender-inclusive housing and found that there was an increase in campus climate perception. So we are moving in the right direction with gender-inclusive housing, and I hope that we can continue to do that and continue to prove overall to help LGBTQ students feel at home here, because we are seeing an increasing number. About 20% of Gen Z adults identify as LGBTQ. So that's going to be about 1 in 5 students in your classroom. So, or, next to you, or, down the hall, right? So, yeah, thank you so much.
Hello. Hi. My name is Dr. Zachary Arth, and I'm an assistant professor of sports communication and the assistant director of the Center for Sports Communication, which tells you that I study sports. Which every time I tell that to somebody for the first time, I always kind of brace myself for the reaction. I think people think sports are cool and sports are interesting, but I don't know if people always see sports as a valid area of research, right? It's entertainment, it's not science, but it is. And I don't know why I always wonder that, just because I know if I polled this audience right now, which I will not do, I know about 80 to 90% of you identify as sports fans in some capacity. So you love sports, we all love sports, but is it research? That's kind of where I come in, right? So one of the contexts that I tend to care about quite a bit is the Olympic Games. In the Olympics, you have 15 to 20 million people tuning in each night for about 2.5 weeks. You have international superiority on the line. You have sports you've never once heard of, but you love it and you watch it. And that's not really the context I study it from, though, because generally speaking in the sports world, women in sports media are very much pushed down. If you were to turn on ESPN, you would be lucky if 5% of ESPN's coverage featured women in sports. However, the Olympics have always been a little bit different, and it's been studied for a number of years. And me, as a scientist, get my DVR, and I get my stopwatch, and I go and say goodbye to my friends and family for about 2.5 weeks, and I watch a lot of Olympic coverage, timing the seconds, the minutes, and the hours that men's sports and women's sports are on the screen. And what we found is that while men have dominated there for a number of years too, in 2022 at the Beijing Olympics, women received 60% of the time on camera across that 2.5 weeks, which is a record. That's the highest that's ever been recorded. And that is progress, right? That is great news for anyone watching. Talk about representation, right? If you're a young girl watching, you see that sports is not just for men. We all know this, but I don't think it's talked about as much as maybe it should be, right? Even the casual, passive idea of just who's on TV. When we put women on TV more often, that's inspiring and it's meaningful. However, let's think about the sports that women receive all that time in. Generally speaking, across the summer and winter Olympic Games, you see things like figure skating and gymnastics and beach volleyball. Now listen, these are great sports, they're great competitions, but what does it tell you, right, when you're watching and you see, okay, to be on TV, I have to either wear a sparkly outfit, or I have to perform this graceful sport, or I have to be wearing nearly nothing at all. Less than ideal, right? Less than ideal. But again, this is just some of the context that can be studied through the Olympic Games. I mean, if we think about some of the major stories that have come out of the Olympics over the past handful of years, you have Simone Biles, maybe one of the most decorated Olympians in US history, an incredible performer, who underwent a true real-time battle with mental health, right? And you talk about the way that she battled through it, and you can look at the way it was received, right? Some of the reception was very positive, some was very negative. She bailed on her country. That's not good either. And then we could talk about hosting the Olympics in China, where there is just ongoing a number of human rights violations happening, right? And maybe we shouldn't be rewarding this country with these Olympic Games. And whether or not we should even be having the games during COVID in the first place is another story altogether. And then if we think about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that took place 4 days after the Winter Olympics ended. Do you think that's a coincidence? We are fighting wars around sports. So whenever I think about whether or not sports matter and why we talk about them and what they mean, I think about all of those things, right? I think about the Olympics, and I think about how politics and how identity is always on display. And I think about sort of the ways that we can sort of learn about representation and about social issues and about our world and about ourselves all through sport. Because we all care about it and we all love it, and we can look at it more critically too. And that's, again, kind of where I come in. So every time I start to doubt myself, or I don't know, I worry if people think I'm doing real research, we're all doing real research, right? But we have our own context. Sports is just my context, and I can end, the end of the day feeling good knowing that studying sports matters. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to quote Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and the most inhumane. So my name is Kevin Henry. I'm a senior professional lecturer of athletic training in the School of Science. And my talk this morning is quite literally a matter of life and death, and that is healthcare inequalities in the United States. Racism negatively affects the mental and physical health of millions of people, thus preventing them from attaining their highest level of health and consequently affecting the health of our nation. So while studies might suggest that health behaviors such as diet and exercise and smoking are the primary drivers of health outcomes, it's the social and economic factors that are driving our health behaviors. So the data show that racial and minority groups throughout the United States are experiencing higher rates of illness and death across a wide variety of different conditions: asthma, diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, when compared with their white counterparts. Additionally, the life expectancy of non-Hispanic Black Americans is 4 years lower than that of the white population. So the impact of racism creates inequalities in access to a range of social and economic benefits, such as housing, education, wealth, and employment. People with disabilities, people from some racial and ethnic minority groups, those from rural areas, even white Americans with lower incomes, are more likely to face multiple barriers to accessing healthcare. Structural barriers such as lack of insurance, lack of transportation, lack of access to childcare, the inability to take time off from work, all make it difficult to go to the doctor. Additionally, cultural differences, language barriers make patient and provider interactions more challenging and thus affecting the quality of care received. People from minority groups are disproportionately affected by difficulties finding affordable and quality housing. In addition, access to nutritious, affordable foods may be limited for these groups, and they may experience more environmental pollution based on the neighborhoods they reside in. People who have been historically marginalized are also disproportionately affected by inequities in access to high-quality education. One HHS study found that over a third of adults in the United States have limited personal health literacy and thus are at a higher risk for misunderstanding information that is important to achieving and maintaining their health. Those with less education may find limited employment options or jobs that often have lower incomes and thus experience barriers to wealth and to carry greater debt. And such financial challenges may make it difficult to manage expenses, pay medical bills, and access affordable quality housing, education, nutritious food, and affordable childcare. Now, college graduates have better self-reported health than high school graduates, and individuals with more education are less likely to report conditions such as heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, anxiety, and depression. Furthermore, individuals with more education are more likely to exercise, less likely to drink alcohol, and seek preventative health care when needed. Notwithstanding that minority and multiracial students may experience additional stressors, such as discrimination and debt accumulation, which have the potential to affect their academic outcomes. So what can we do about this? Well, in education systems, we have to continue to strengthen the curriculum at the primary and secondary levels to better prepare students for college, offer them peer or faculty mentoring to help students apply to schools, secure financial aid, and feel a sense of community, and expand access to subsidies such as scholarships and financial aid to increase not only enrollment, but academic college completion. Employers should be training employees at all levels of organizations to identify and interrupt all forms of discrimination, to provide them with training in implicit bias, and to establish and maintain equitable leave policies that are fair and flexible to meet the needs of all employees. And finally, in our communities, we can promote health equity by adopting policies and programs that recognize and support the diversity of the communities that we live in, to include community engagement efforts that can help to strengthen partnerships between community members and their public health entities, to engage with trusted leaders who share the same beliefs as the community in order to better share information, and finally, to partner with trusted messengers to share clear and accurate information that's tailored to the community's culture, language, and literacy levels. So finally, in closing, you do not have to be a healthcare provider in order to improve health. You just have to be able to demonstrate care. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Pamela Harper. I'm an associate professor in the School of Management, and I also serve as the chair of the marketing department. And I want to talk with you about my research project, which is entitled Ethics Under Pressure. And this project really is a collaboration between a few colleagues of mine in the School of Management, as well as a colleague in the mathematics department at Baylor. And that would include Dr. John Carey, Dr. Pablo Rivas, Dr. Bill Brown, and myself. And our intent with this research was to study the relationship between employees and organizations, their ethical behaviors or lack thereof, and the effects of pressure on those particular behaviors, whether it's conducive or whether it's debilitating in terms of ethical conduct. And I do want to give you a quick sneak peek in terms of the results of our research. We found that there is a non-linear relationship between employee factors such as the employment level, the tenure of the individual in the organization, and the company size, whether it's a large conglomerate versus a small startup. And then we also, of course, looked at the impact on ethicality, and then separately looked at the impact of pressure, which we did find had a dampening impact on that outcome. So in terms of the importance of this research, I do find it necessary to ground the research in theory. as we do in social sciences. And there have been numerous scholars that have examined ethics from a number of different perspectives. And they've done so throughout the years, over time, starting from Socrates all the way through Bernard Williams. And they really have looked at ethics in terms of its broader sense and as a reference and a reflective answer to the question of, well, how are we to live, particularly among one another? And in addition, there has been seminal research on this topic of ethicality, but then also pressure, in looking at the impact on human behavior and looking at the impact of groups and workplaces and how that has had an impact on behaviors for individual. And some of the work that's been completed has been by Solomon Asch and many others, and from a seminal perspective. And their findings have indicated that, in fact, when there is pressure exerted from a dominant group, it has caused subjects to actually behave knowingly in an incorrect behavior. And one research result actually showed that that occurred in 75% of the cases. And then, of course, we all know that there have been many high-profile corporate scandals that have splashed across the headlines, giving light to unethical behavior by employees as well as their corporate cultures and environments. And so, taking all of this together, we found it necessary. We found a gap in terms of the literature that begged, further questions in terms of research. And so, based on the literature, we developed three primary hypotheses. And the first one was that we expected to find a nonlinear relationship, as I indicated before, between employment levels and ethicality, such that low employment levels and very high employment levels would be more positively related to ethicality. And then we further hypothesized that pressure would have a dampening impact. And then our second hypothesis was that, again, we would expect to find a nonlinear relationship between time employed, meaning those newly employed versus those who had been with the organization for some time, and ethicality, with, again, the sub-hypothesis being that pressure would have a dampening impact on that outcome as far as ethicality. And then the third hypothesis was that we would expect to find a nonlinear relationship between company size, whether it be a small versus a very large conglomerate, and ethicality, with, once again, the sub-hypothesis being that pressure would have a dampening impact. And so we interrogated our hypotheses using empirical approaches. We conducted a survey. We also made use of statistical analysis, regression analysis, and we did find support for our first two hypotheses with partial support for our third hypothesis. So, the impact of our research. We believe that we have helped to further advance the understanding in the literature in terms of behavioral ethicality and the relationship between certain employee characteristics and ethicality. And we also have attempted to provide practitioners in the field with a better understanding of behaviors as it relates to ethics and conduct and the particular environments that might be more conducive or debilitating. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Boscarino, and I am an associate professor and chair of political science in the School of Liberal Arts. And I'm going to talk to you about telling stories about climate change. I research and teach about environmental politics, and I'm especially interested in how environmental groups can use rhetorical strategies to move the political needle. One of my personal climate heroes is Katharine Hayhoe, who's an academic at Texas Tech University. And in addition to her scientific research, She does a lot of work on helping people communicate with others about climate change, especially those who might have very different views from our own. And how does she suggest that we do this? Well, she suggests that we ask people to tell their story. So what do they love? What do they want to protect? What are they afraid of? And then here's the crucial part. You have to listen to what they say. And you have to look for where their story intersects with your story. And it might be in unexpected areas. It might be about appreciation for a special place, or fears for your children's future, or a common hobby like downhill skiing, or maybe even a shared religious faith that tells you to look out for the more vulnerable. But whatever it is, storytelling is a very powerful way of uncovering those connections. But how does this lead to meaningful change? Because ultimately, if we want to tackle the climate crisis, then we need really aggressive policies. And this is where I put on my political science hat and say, how does storytelling help with that? Well, my research uses something called the narrative policy framework. And this is a framework that builds off of what we intuitively know to be true, which is that we are naturally a storytelling species and that stories matter. And it applies empirical methods to provide evidence of those truths. And so there's a growing body of research within this framework that looks at narrative persuasion, which is the ability to use storytelling elements like characters and plot lines and symbols as a way to facilitate opinion change by arousing emotion and transporting listeners. And so narrative policy framework scholars are using this to improve science communication on issues like climate change, but also other contentious scientific issues like childhood vaccine safety, for example. So in a recent research project of my own, I tested the premise that storytelling can influence policy attitudes by using a case study of the Dakota Access oil pipeline in the Midwest. Now, when construction on this pipeline started in 2016, there was a lot of controversy over it, a lot of debate, and a lot of opposition, both due to climate change concerns, because it is fossil fuel infrastructure, but also concerns for native rights, because part of the path of the pipeline runs adjacent to land that is the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation. So there's a lot of different issues at play here. And so first what I did was construct a story about this pipeline. And so I built off of actual news stories and firsthand accounts of the controversy, and I wove in all of these different narrative elements that I mentioned. So we had some very compelling characters. We had a very vivid setting, a plot full of twists and turns, and ultimately a moral of the story, which was shut down the pipeline. So it's presenting the opposition perspective. And then I conducted survey research, and some of my participants in the study heard this story and others did not, and then I asked them all about their views on this issue. And my results showed three main findings. So first, hearing the narrative made the participants more likely to see the issue of oil pipelines in America generally as more important than those who did not. Second, they were also more likely to adopt the anti-pipeline perspective, so their attitudes were more in line with the moral of the story that I mentioned earlier. And lastly, many of these effects were even further enhanced when the stories also included visual elements, such as photographs or protest art, which made the story even more persuasive. So what my study demonstrates is that telling stories about policy issues can both raise their salience to an audience and shift attitudes in a desired direction. And given that a major obstacle to achieving progress on climate change is climate disinformation and polarization of policy attitudes on this issue, my hope is that this research would be very instructive to policy advocates. So for example, in my own life outside of academia, I volunteer with a climate change NGO that advocates for climate legislation. And when I joined the group, I participated in a bunch of training sessions to learn how to lobby effectively. And do you know what the first thing was that we were taught to do when we introduce ourselves to a member of Congress in a lobby session? We're told to tell our climate story. So what's your climate story? We all have one. I invite you to ask this of yourself and think about where your story might intersect with others. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Christina Wright Fields. I'm an assistant professor in the education department. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And today I'm going to talk to you about my journey to NIA and how I research and redefine identity in education. As educators, our journeys began with a purpose. As educators, our journeys began with a why. Every year, educators should reevaluate their purpose. We should reconsider our why. NIA is the fifth principle of Kwanzaa, a cultural holiday based on the customs of Africa. NIA essentially means purpose. It encourages individuals to set personal goals, but also think about how might these personal goals impact their community. My purpose in education is greatly influenced by my identity. I am unapologetically Black and a woman. These two intersectional identities impact my understanding of self and my interactions with others. A lot of my scholarship focuses on Black women and girls' lived experiences in education. As a Black woman, I continue Black feminist thought theorist and sociologist Patricia H. Collins' work of developing a distinctive Black women's standpoint by utilizing alternative ways of validating and affirming our knowledge. I build on the foundation of many Black women, educators, activists, scholars, artists such as Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks, and Toni Morrison. But today, I want to share research I published with my colleague, my sister scholar, Dr. Stephanie Power Carter, a faculty member out of The Ohio State University. We developed and taught an innovative curriculum for cultural identity course for high school students. During the course, we engaged students in activities and dialogue and lectures where they explored culture and identity. They began to learn key vocabulary terms such as oppression, privilege, and hegemony. They read various texts such as W.E. Du Bois' Double Consciousness, and they began to learn about the cultural legacies, the history, the scholars that came before them. Students began to learn how to apply this new knowledge to their lived experiences and their societal encounters. As we taught the course, Dr. Stephanie Power Carter and I, we were our authentic selves. We shared our lived experiences, whether I was sharing that we attended predominantly white institutions, PWIs, we were the first in our family to go to college, we were raised in an urban environment, or perhaps being the only student of color in a gifted and talented program. We were our true selves. For some of these students, this was the first time that they interacted with faculty, women of color. A few of them mentioned that they were beginning to see themselves in us. Representation matters. We conducted a qualitative study using the writings of a group of 11th grade Black girls in the course to illustrate what happens when the youth are afforded opportunities to share their truth. Essentially, we explored how they utilize literacy as a writing tool to share and make visible what was once invisible. We did a thematic analysis of how students culminated written assignment, a manifesto, how to inform their lived experiences. The manifesto assignment consisted of the students responding back to a prompt where they explored, reflected, and articulated who they were as individuals and how might their identity impact their societal experiences. They wrote multifaceted and complex representations of who they were. And they began to reposition their identity and disrupt the master narrative that was informed by dominant culture. In our findings, we noticed that the Black young women engaged in self-empowerment. They made affirming and liberating statements about their potential to excel in relation to grades, high school graduation, college enrollment, and potential career goals. For one scholar, it was no longer if they were going to college, rather it was when I go to college, I'm going to study political science, I'm going to become a lawyer, and I'm going to give back to my community. They began to realize and affirm the value of post-secondary education, not only on themselves, but also their community. Students also began to notice the importance of legacy and paying it forward. They proudly mentioned that they would become the first student in their family to go to college, and that they hope to inspire other students in their neighborhoods, as well as younger relatives. So to quote Vice President Kamala Harris, I may be the first, but I won't be the last. So again, representation matters. We noticed that when students not only understood, but embraced their identity, they became better scholars. They became more motivated. They developed more self-efficacy. They also became more self-aware. So by creating these intentional and welcoming spaces, we provide an opportunity for the youth to affirm and validate their experiences. I began my chat today with one word, Nia, which meant purpose. I own who I am, when one of my purpose is to uplift the voices of Black women and girls in education. This connects to my why. Why did I get a PhD? I got a PhD to make change in my community through research and scholarly endeavors. Why do I conduct the research? I conduct the research transformative learning experiences for my scholars. So I'm gonna leave you with two questions. How does your purpose influence your work? And what is your why? Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ron Coleman. I'm a professor of computer science, and I wanted to talk to you briefly about code and art. You may have heard of GitHub. It's the world's largest distributed source code version control hosting service. In 2018, Microsoft acquired GitHub for $7.5 billion. That same year, they published a report called State of the Octoverse, which described GitHub as having 96 million or 40% more repositories that year compared to the prior year. I estimated from that figure, by simple extrapolation, that more than 99% of all software on any given day was in maintenance mode. This means possibly having to modify a software product after delivery to correct faults, to improve performance or other attributes, or to adapt the product to a modified environment. Take iLearn, for instance. It comes from the Sakai repository in the Octoverse, and it needs to be modified before we can use it here at Marist. In 2014, my graduate student, Pritesh Gandhi, and I began mining scientific and systems repositories in the Octoverse. We were searching for beauty that is as a precise mathematical measure of programming style based on fractals, self-similar, nor differentiable geometric objects. According to Mandelbrot, fractals are the geometry of nature as manifested in the textured patterns within patterns of coastlines, mountain ranges, vascular branching, plant growth, even price fluctuations of corn futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. So what we were saying is that this fractal in the circular image up above there exists in a certain way in the code in the outer image up above there. Since 1999, physicists, art researchers, and others have theorized that since fractals are often associated with natural beauty, they might use them to authenticate masterpieces. For instance, the action paintings of Jackson Pollock. Well, Pritesh and I, we were doing the same sort of thing, except with code. We were writing programs to take thousands of encoded snapshots of other programs as if they were paintings or photographs. And indeed, we found evidence of our fractals that were correlated with known software quality metrics. For instance, code length and code complexity we found are anti-correlated with fractal beauty in code, a finding that software engineers had intuited for decades as best practices. We also discovered that fractal beauty is positively correlated with maintainability, a conclusion that few Octoverse programmers would find surprising. Curiously, these correlations are precisely what one would expect if code in its layout possessed a measurable quantity of prettiness. In other words, literally an aesthetic value. Thus, for the first time, I could offer my students empirical justifications for good taste and decent manners in code. And it begged the next question that I'm still working on. If code in its way is a kind of art, is art in its way a kind of code? Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Okay, that concludes our staff talks. That concludes our staff talks. My name is Della Soon. I was working with Ernst and James to put this together. And mainly, I'd like to thank our colleagues for sharing insights into their research and what motivates them. I think they did a phenomenal job of explaining something that deeply motivates them. It's important to all of us in just 5 minutes each. So thank you. And our next scheduled event is in the same Deli Galletti Theater at 11 o'clock. We have an academic symposium scheduled that I think you'll find fascinating. But if you want to stretch your legs, I recommend that you go in and look at the celebration of poster sessions across the way, and there are refreshments also. But come back at 11. We'll see you soon.